Hello and welcome. I'm Alison Gallensky. This presentation is from Wild Connections, and I work for Rocky Mountain Wild and am also a longtime volunteer with Wild Connections. And I appreciate everyone joining. Going to ask that people keep their cameras turned off and their microphones muted during the presentation. You can type into the chat if you have questions. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll have a chance for people to ask questions either through chat or by turning on the microphone. The purpose of this presentation is to talk about a project that I have been working collaboratively with Wild Connections for the last several years on updating the Wild Connections Conservation Plan with climate change in mind. We will be talking about the organization Wild Connections, about the question we are trying to ask and answer, which is where will biodiversity persist as the climate changes? Talk about geospatial modeling that we have been doing to identify climate refugia and corridors. Try to make this a little more concrete by talking about some specific places and talk about the next steps in this process. Wild Connections is an organization that works in central Colorado, specifically in the Arkansas and South Platte River watersheds. Wild Connections works to identify, protect, and restore native species and biodiversity in this region. Wild Connections focuses on public lands, including the Pike and San Isabel National Forests and the Bureau of Land Management Royal Gorge Field Office. This map shows the region that Wild Connections works in. This is a region that is south of Interstate 70 in Colorado, primarily east of Interstate 25. Primarily west of Interstate 25 and east of the Continental Divide. Does not include the San Luis Valley, but it does include other lands east of the Divide and east of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. And I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge that these lands were historically occupied by the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute native tribes, and were also visited by many other tribes and include lands that were sacred to the Navajo. I mentioned that Wild Connections, one of their focuses is on biodiversity. That is also a focus of Rocky Mountain Wild, which is the organization that I work for. And I am a GIS analyst, GIS director at Rocky Mountain Wild. And GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems, or Geographic Information Science. And my job at Rocky Mountain Wild is to map and do geospatial analysis of areas in Colorado and the surrounding region. And one of the things that both of our organizations focus on is biodiversity. Biodiversity refers to the diverse variety of healthy native animal and plant communities. This image shows that biodiversity can be measured in several different ways. You can look at the total number of species within a region or an area. You can look at, within each species, the genetic diversity, so how much difference is there between the different animals or plants within the species, and that leads to having more genetic diversity makes the species more resilient. The number of species that occur in this place and nowhere else in the world. The number of ecosystems in the region and the number of unique ecosystems. We know that the climate is changing, and that changes in the climate threaten biodiversity. They may make it harder for certain animal and plant species to persist. They may change where those animals and plants live. Climate refugia are places where we believe that biodiversity will persist. And in order for the entire region to be healthy, we need to have ways for species to go between these refugia and to other places that are with healthy biodiversity. Climate refugia specifically are places where the climate change is expected to happen more slowly than in the surrounding region. So these are places where species can adapt more easily to the changes in the climate because the changes aren't happening as quickly. Landscape connectivity is a way for animals to move in between places. They may be moving seasonally as they migrate from their summer to winter ranges. They may be moving as new generations disperse from where they were born. And they may need to move because the places where they're most healthy, their range is changing as the climate changes. The technique that we used to identify these places was to do geospatial modeling. So to create a model on a map of places that we believe will persist in the face of a changing climate. This graph shown on this slide is based on a approach that's sometimes called the Yale model. And it was because it was defined by a team that was led by professors from the Yale School of Forestry. And this model shows different approaches, different ways, things that make it more likely that an area will have good biodiversity. And it is done at different levels. So focusing on specific species and populations at a higher level on ecosystems, and then across different, across entire landscapes. And the approach presents 6 different adaptation approaches and suggests that that you model as many of these as makes sense in the region. And you'll see that in this chart that we've modeled some but not all of these approaches and some but not all of these scales. And in the rest of the presentation, I'll be showing how we did this modeling and what the results were. This modeling combined dozens of different data sets. The reason is that all models are an attempt to describe what's happening in the natural world, and all of the models are incomplete. But by combining together different models and different data sets, we hope to have a more complete understanding what is happening now and even more difficult, what will happen in the future. We used models from local organizations, regional organizations, including Wild Connections itself, from statewide organizations like Colorado Parks and Wildlife, the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, and national organizations and international organizations such as the Nature Conservancy and NatureServe. Showing again the region, the Wild Connections region, because this shape is going to show up in the maps that I'm going to share without as many of the landmarks that are shown on this map. So just get an idea that the southern end of the region is the New Mexico border. The northeastern is the edge of the Denver metropolitan area. The east central includes Colorado Springs, Pueblo, and Walsenburg. And the western edge includes Leadville and Salida. The first component of the model, and perhaps the one that has been the most modeled, is current biodiversity. So these are places that are important for animal and plant species today. And we use data from Colorado Parks and Wildlife, from the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and from the US Fish and Wildlife Service to focus. So we're focused on common species like big game that show the overall health of a region, more rare species such as cutthroat trout, and species that have been identified as endangered or threatened under the Endangered Species Act, such as prebbles, meadow, jumping mouse, and Mexican spotted owl. And this shows the result of that analysis, this map. And let me show you also, share with you a interactive map that I've created where you can see all of these different models, and you can zoom in, as I'm doing now, to show more detail. So for example, in this model of current biodiversity, let me show you the legend. And it shows that the darker areas are have a higher level of biodiversity, are farther from the average, and the lighter areas are below average. And this model shows that certain areas in the region are particularly important for biodiversity. This includes the South Park area. It includes the Mosquito Range, which have some of the most rare plants in this region. A lot of the river corridors, especially along the Arkansas River, include areas that are particularly high in biodiversity, and along the South Platte River corridor as well. So the second model component that I modeled was areas that we call intact natural landscapes. So these are areas that are not fragmented by human development or by other barriers to movement, such as river corridors. And it's a central tenet of conservation biology that these large intact areas are very important to biodiversity. They provide room for animals to spread out without the effects of human encroachment. And the sources that we used for this model component included the Colorado Natural Heritage Program Landscape Disturbance Index, which shows areas that are more or less impacted by human development and activity, and roadless analyses of federal public lands, Bureau of Land Management, and Forest Service lands, including wilderness. And this map shows the result of that analysis, showing that the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and the Lost Creek Wilderness areas include some of the largest areas that are intact. And this model was weighted for larger areas because conservation biology shows that larger areas are better at supporting populations than smaller areas. Going back to the interactive map, I can turn off the current biodiversity and turn on the natural landscapes layer, and again, scroll through and see different areas, including an area in southern Colorado along the Sangre de Cristo Mountains that is very important, that is, has a high degree of unfragmented natural landscape. The third model component is called Geophysical Settings. This comes from a study that was done maybe 20 years ago, looking for what aspects of a landscape are most associated with biodiversity. Not looking at the animals and plants, but looking at the underlying topography, soils, so the shape of the lands, and discovered that there are some components, water as well, that are associated with biodiversity. And the Nature Conservancy has done an extensive study of this, done extensive modeling of landscape diversity, and has identified some areas in this region that are have higher degrees of that are predicted to have higher degrees of biodiversity. And you can see, again, scrolling into the map, you can see a number of river corridors, and in this case, some of the closer by mountain ranges, such as the Front Range and the Wet Mountains, that have high degrees of biodiversity based on the geophysical setting. One of the most important components for our analysis is the climate resilience component. Once again, the Nature Conservancy has done a lot of modeling in this area at a regional-wide scale, and we are working to refine their model and make it more applicable at our scale of the Wild Connections region. They worked across the entire Rocky Mountain region to do their analysis. And along with their analysis of places that will remain resilient in the face of climate change, we brought in data from the Fish and Wildlife Service on wetlands in our region. And we also did some modeling of areas where cold air tends to form pools, sort of as water does. And these are areas where the climate also changes less quickly. And this map shows the result of that analysis. And zooming in a little bit, you can see a lot of river corridors. You can see again the Front Range, the Arkansas River corridor and the Wet Mountains, and some of the other river corridors such as the, now let's zoom in and see which river corridor this is. Including places like Turkey Ridge and Gold Canyon. And the other very important part of this analysis is ecological connectivity. I talked a little bit earlier about how movement corridors are very important for seasonal migration, for dispersal by new generations, and for shifts in where the animals live as climate change causes the ideal habitats to move. And to do this portion of the modeling, I used data from Colorado Parks and Wildlife of where different big game species are currently migrating from their winter to summer ranges. And I used data from the Nature Conservancy, model results from the Nature Conservancy, where they modeled both current local connectivity and places that they predict will be corridors as the climate changes. And this shows, this map shows the results of that modeling and shows that there's quite a few areas that are good for connectivity within the Wild Connections region. And zooming in again a little bit more, there's some areas along the Arkansas River corridor and north of the river that are especially important. There are areas on the edges of South Park that are important, and there are corridors throughout the various mountain ranges. Okay, so the next step, this concludes the different models that we that I created, and the next step is to pull these together to create a model of the climate refugia and corridors. And this is where the modeling is still ongoing. We're looking for places where biodiversity will persist, and looking for an approach for combining our models together to predict those places. As we refine the model and as we gain some on-the-ground knowledge and do some site visits, that will make the model more robust. So this map shows a preliminary result of combining together all of these models. In our interactive map, you can see that some areas are starting to show up darker in this. Again, looking for the areas that are well above average in this model. Areas are showing up along the Arkansas River, along through the Wet Mountains, along the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, along the Front Range and the South Platte River corridor, and along some of these river corridors south of Pueblo. And then we needed a way to take these results and define specific areas that should be protected, either as connectivity areas or as refugia, climate refugia. So I worked at dividing up this region, the public lands in this region, based on existing designations such as wilderness, areas that the Forest Service has identified as roadless areas, and also that Wild Connections has mapped as roadless, and areas that the Bureau of Land Management has identified as having wilderness characteristics, which includes roadlessness. This model was also applied to other public land areas, such as state parks and state wildlife areas, regional parks, and even some private lands when we knew that they were protected under conservation easements. I took the results of this modeling and dividing this landscape up into areas and identified the average score across all of these, for each of the areas based on these different models. So going back to my interactive map, can look at the current biodiversity model and then turn on the areas. I'll turn off the background to make it stand out more. And it identified among all these areas which ones have above average scores, average score across the area for current biodiversity. And the goal of our effort was to identify areas that are important, that could serve as climate refuges or refugia, and areas that could serve an important role for connectivity. And I have now turned on in the map the layers that show these areas, and the darker they are shown, the better they scored across these different models. Okay, let me move on to make this a little bit more specific by talking about 4 different areas across the Wild Connections region. I'm going to start by talking about the Upper Red Canyon area. That's north of Canyon City. It has been identified by the Bureau of Land Management and Wild Connections as having wilderness characteristics. That means that this is an area that would be eligible to be protected as a wilderness if Congress designated it as such, and an area that we are working with the Bureau of Land Management to make sure that this place retains those characteristics. And you can see on the slide how this area scored across the different categories. And this area in particular scored high, both for ecological connectivity and across all of the models combined to create the climate refugia score shown here. So going back to the map, I can zoom into this particular area here, north of Canyon City. And one thing that, one capability of this map is that you can click on an area and you can see now the Upper Red Canyon recommended wilderness. And you can see how it scored across all of the different model components. moving on to a different part of our region. This is the Farnham area, which is west of the Lost Creek Wilderness on the edge of South Park. And this is an area that did not score as high across all of the models as a climate refuge, but it did score particularly well for ecological connectivity. This is an area that the Forest Service has identified as roadless, that Wild Connections recommends as wilderness, and it's an area where Wild Connections has done a number of restoration projects to ensure that the core of this area remains intact. So going back to the interactive map, the Lost Creek Wilderness area is here and now in the center of the map. And here's the Farnham recommended wilderness area. Again, you can see its size at over 19,000 acres. And you can see the scores across the different models, including the fact that it had a 66% score as for ecological connectivity. Third place I'm going to focus on is the Purgatory area, which is southwest of the Spanish Peaks Wilderness. This is an area that scored well both for ecological connectivity and across all of the scores, giving it an above average score as a climate refuge. And this is another area that was identified by the Forest Service as roadless and that Wild Connections recommended as wilderness in the Wild Connections plan that came out almost 20 years ago. Going back to the map, let's see if I can remember where this area is. Okay. That's Greenhorn Mountain. I identified this as being the Spanish Peaks Wilderness area. Spanish Peaks Wilderness. And here is an example of a conservation easement along the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Since I'm not finding the Purgatory area, why don't I talk about how conservation easements, so private land that is protected, can also play an important role in preserving biodiversity. And this is a place that has scored well for ecological connectivity in particular. Okay, so these are the areas that I wanted to highlight. Let me just talk quickly about the next steps and then open this session up for questions and let people get on with their evening. So part of what we're doing with this modeling is to get the word out about it and to get solicit input, and that is what we are doing tonight. We're also going to be showing this model to experts within public agencies and perhaps academia in order to gain support and for the model and to refine it. We're going to spend some time ground truthing areas that this model predicts are important and see if those areas have the characteristics that the model defines as we finalize the model, we're going to present it to the land management agencies, including the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service, as they undertake planning processes, including the Eastern Colorado Resource Management Plan update that is going on now, and the Pike San Isabel National Forest Plan revision, which we expect will be starting sometime soon. And finally, I want to mention that personally, I'm hoping that this is a useful approach to help organizations figure out which places are the most important to advocate for, and that I can take this approach and use it in other places. Let me end now by putting up some information about the organizations and people that were involved. So this shows my email address, the website for Rocky Mountain Wild and Wild Connections, and the way that you can view this interactive map that I created. And I will get in touch with everyone who signed up for this presentation and send you this information as well. Okay, I've stopped the sharing now, and would be happy to take some questions. And I see that Suzanne O'Neill has shared that the Colorado Wildlife Federation is working on the proposed revisions in the South Park area of the Eastern Colorado Resource Management Plan, and I'd be glad to talk to you more about that.
Thank you, Alison. It's really been a good presentation.
Thank you, Jim.
I noticed that the southern part of the Sangre de Cristo range, excuse me, the Sawatch range doesn't have the same connectivity as the northern part, is it? Maybe because of the contours or the terrain?
It's a good question. So the question is, some of the parts of the Sawatch range do not have this good connectivity. I actually don't have an answer to that, but I will look into that. It could be because of highways going through that area. It could be because of the landscape. Okay, I know this has been a busy and exciting couple of weeks for people. I'll give folks a little bit more time to let me know if they have any questions now. And of course, you're welcome to reach out to me after this presentation.
Alison, there's a question from Kurt Cunningham in the chat.
Thank you. So Kirk is asking, have any similar analyses been done on BLM lands in Moffat County? Carl Ford, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the regional assessments that the Bureau of Land Management has done, because that's probably the closest that has been done. Okay, I'm not sure if Carl is still present, but one of the initiatives that inspired us to do this analysis were some regional analyses done by the Bureau of Land Management across the West. And I'm not sure if they included Moffat County. There have also been some analyses that were sponsored by the Pew Research Center that identified some places. Had a question for asking me to share the link to the interactive map. So let me type that in to the chat. And Yvonne asked if there'll be opportunities for citizen science to help with any on-site data collection work. That is absolutely was our intention when we started doing this modeling a couple of years ago. Some of our initiatives, unfortunately, have had to be scaled back because of COVID. However, we're hoping as things open up that we will have some opportunities to do things like putting in place temperature monitors so that we can identify whether a place that has a less wide temperature range than the surrounding areas. And I have a question from Sherry, which says, from the start to the present state, how long does it take to produce these models? And the answer is, we've been working on this project for about 2 years, although it has been an on-again, off-again project. So this is not 2 years of steady work. And it did, we did take a lot of advantage of some much larger projects, such as the ones done by the Nature Conservancy. But I think that's a reasonable expectation, is that a project like this would take a couple of years to get to this state where most of the sub-models are done, and we're refining how to combine them all into a final model. Okay, I'm looking back up to earlier questions. One of the questions was, it looks like you've defined a buffer around the region. What was the distance of this buffer? And I believe I had several different buffers, but the general buffer was a 10-mile buffer, and that is to take into account that at the edge of a model, you might get some strange results because of the fact that there's areas with no data. And Tom asked, what current existing agency policies and directions exist that might require them to consider this? And I'm hoping that in the next day or two, we'll be seeing some announcements from the current US administration suggesting the protection of 30% of the United States by 2030, as a way of protecting biodiversity and combating climate change. And that would have a very strong influence on agencies. There are requirements as agencies update their management plans, whether that's for the Forest Service or for the Bureau of Land Management, that they do inventory lands of wilderness quality. And the Forest Service has rules about recommending wilderness protection, and we're hoping that the Bureau of Land Management rules will also have those requirements going forward. Karen asked who provided funding for this modeling project. That's a great question. At this time, for my portion of this, the funding came from Wild Connections and primarily from individual donors. So thank you to anyone who might have been one of those donors. Question from Tyler. What are the most useful next steps those of us here can take to further the application of these results? Promoting the Colorado Wilderness Act, CORE Act, contacting representatives all come to mind. Absolutely. Tyler is mentioning 2 different proposals that have been made to Congress to protect areas across the strait as wilderness, including areas within the Wild Connections region. Other steps are are shared by organizations like Wild Connections and Rocky Mountain Wild, and those are to work with the agencies that manage these lands and ensure that their planning efforts, which they are required, and they are required to update their plans, that those new plans protect areas that are the most important for preserving biodiversity. And then John asked, how do or did water rights play into this analysis? Aside from paying attention to land ownership, the legal water rights were not part of this analysis. Waterways did play an important role in several of the different analysis components. Water rights play more into the next steps, such as identifying areas that are eligible to be protected as wild or scenic rivers, which is another component that is required to happen, a process that is required to happen as agency plans are updated. And water rights can play a strong role in, after an area is identified as being qualified as a wild or scenic river, what kind of protections that place has or does not have. And one of the most important water rights for biodiversity is called in-stream flows, which is a right for there to be water remain in the river, along with the right for humans to take water out of the river for agriculture and drinking water and all of that. Water rights is a huge and complicated topic, and John, if you have more suggestions about that, I'd love to hear them. I really appreciate all these good questions. If anyone has typed in a question that I did not see, please type it again or tell me to go back and look for it. Since we seem to be wrapping up, let me end by putting again up the contact information and link to the interactive map. And I'd like to thank everyone very much for joining us.
Allison, before people
Yes.
leave, we're going to send you an email with the link to the recording, and it will also be posted. The link will be posted on our website, so you can share that with other people if you care.
So that cut in and out, but what Jean was saying is that a link to this recording will be put on the Wild Connections website and will be emailed to everyone who registered to this for this program, and we encourage you to share that once you receive that. And thank you very much. Let me stop the recording.